So you want to learn a language, but your teachers tell you to pay better attention in class. Your weird uncle tells you to read this book from like 20 years ago, and this friend who swears he can speak 20 languages tells you to just use Duolingo for 5 minutes a day, bro. But which one of these people is actually correct, if any? And how do you learn a language in the best possible way? Hopefully after watching this video, you'll be feeling a bit less confused, as I spent the last month taking a deep dive into the scientific research on language learning, compiling results from over 200 studies to find answers to the most important questions on the topic. You'll find out why a lot of the most popular language learning advice will actually just cause you to get stuck, never reaching your goals, and what to do instead. So let's start off by addressing the biggest question on the topic, which is how we learn languages in general. If you asked any random person of the best way to learn a language, they'd probably say something like studying really hard trying to memorize grammar and vocabulary. But if we look at the research, that's not at all what seems to be the answer. Perhaps the biggest revelation you could take from looking at the research of second language acquisition is the role of input and just how wrong traditional language learning seems to be. The whole shift from favoring grammar instruction and vocabulary study to instead a more natural approach came in the late 1970s from a guy called Dr. Stephen Krashen.
We acquire language in one way and only one way, when we understand messages. We call this comprehensible input.
Krashen's philosophy personally revolutionized my learning as well as many others. And without understanding it, you can never really get fluent. It can all be summed up in 5 main ideas. The first one is that learning and acquiring are two completely different and independent ways of acquiring ability in a second language. Acquiring is similar to what children did when they learned their first language, while learning is more like learning about the language rather than learning the language itself. Krashen argued that even though it might seem like learning grammar and all these things that you do in school, for example, should improve your ability to speak and understand the language, they really don't, and one should focus on acquiring instead of learning language. But there's research supporting this idea that these things are different as well. One example being the work of Rod Ellis, who in this 2005 paper identified that there were actually 2 types of knowledge. Implicit knowledge, like knowing stuff without necessarily knowing why, for example, being able to ride a bicycle, seemed to be more important for actual communication. While explicit knowledge, which would be knowing a lot about bicycle riding, helped participants score higher in rule-based tests where they had to explain why something was correct or not. And so it seems that Krashen's first hypothesis was correct, which would also line up with his other hypothesis called the monitor hypothesis. This pretty much states that trying to rely on grammar rules and such in a conversation is very impractical, and that they can only really be used when you have a lot of time to, for example, write something. And in those cases, they can be used to polish what it is you're writing, when you have time to think about what the correct usage of certain words and grammar endings and such are. And to me this makes a lot of sense, because imagine if you, for example, try to introduce yourself to someone, and they ask you a question, and instead of just answering spontaneously, you're stuck there trying to decide which version of the past tense to use. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? It's never happened to you in your native language, I hope, but if you've learned any other language, it probably has happened to you. And just a wild guess, I bet your goal isn't to score well in tests that specifically ask you why something is correct or not. Your goal is probably just to be able to understand and speak the language itself, which in that case, you definitely want to be acquiring rather than learning language. And that's where Krashen's next and probably most important idea comes in, which is the input hypothesis. It claims that humans only acquire language in one way, which is by understanding messages in it, aka receiving what he calls comprehensible input. That's basically anything where you can listen to or read something and understand most of what's being said. Krashen said that the best comprehensible input is a little bit more difficult than our current level. He called this I plus 1. Think of the I as your current level, and I being something new that when you hear it, you automatically understand it because of the context and you understand so much already that this is now your current level. And then you hear something new and something else and you learn that as well. So you basically just keep adding pieces to your current understanding until you're fluent essentially. A practical example of this could be that you're reading something in a language and there's a sentence saying, I got in my ... and drove to the store. Now, of course, this could be a bus, it could be a tank, it could be a motorcycle, whatever, probably not a motorcycle, but it could be something else, but most likely it's a car, right? And now if you hear that multiple times saying there were many ... dots in the parking lot, well, now you understand it, right? And so that's sort of how this works. You hear something, and because you already understand so much, you now naturally acquire it. This way of learning stuff is way more effective than just seeing it in a textbook or something like that, because of the context that you already have. It's way more similar to how you learn stuff in your native language, which causes you to be able to use that without thinking so much. It's not all about translating between one language to the other, it's rather developing a natural understanding for how language works and where certain stuff is supposed to be used in conjunction with other things. And despite these ideas being developed over 40 years ago, the research continues to show that input is essential to learn a language, with reading often coming out on top. This paper by Van Patten shows that learners who engage in meaningful input do a better job at acquiring grammar than those who rely on explicit instruction. So, even though you might have previously thought that you have to be aware of the grammar rules to be able to use them properly, that doesn't seem to be the case, and so long as you're exposed to them with plenty of context, you should be able to acquire them and then later use them naturally. This type of learning is often called immersion learning, and it seems to be the best kind of learning for acquiring language. But when consuming this input, it's also very important that you don't make the all too common mistake on relying on the subtitles of your native language, instead of fully being immersed in the other language you're trying to learn. The issue with using native language subtitles is that it will take the focus away from the language itself and instead just have you following along more in the story, which could be beneficial for enjoyment, but won't let your brain process the language and actually acquire it. And this idea is actually supported by a recent meta-analysis where they found that using target language subtitles outperformed both native language and no subtitles. And that while native language subs help you understand more, they won't actually get you to fluency. So even though you might have thought that beginners should use native language subtitles because stuff is too difficult for them, the real solution is probably just to be okay not understanding everything, and to learn along the way, or to find input that's simply easier for them. The reason for this is because using native language subtitles will have you translating from language to language instead of developing your own understanding of the language, which is a crucial mistake all too many people make, and the reason why you have people who, for example, have watched anime for decades, but they still can't say more than a few phrases of Japanese. That's simply because they haven't engaged enough with the language yet, and if they watched without any subtitles, maybe they would have already been fluent. Hopefully by now you understand the importance of input, but you might still be asking yourself how to make content easy if you don't understand much. And that's where I'm going to share a trick with you. Something that's helped me a lot is to find stuff that not only talks about different topics, but also show them. Because watching long-form uninterrupted talks about any kind of topic can be pretty difficult. You want to find stuff that instead has limited topics, where they not only talk about stuff, but also show what they're talking about. Examples of good input for beginners can be stuff like graded readers, webtoons, or anything specifically made for beginners. And luckily for you, there's a lot of content made on YouTube specifically for language learners in various languages, ranging from complete beginner to advanced level. So even if you're just starting out in a language, there are tons of channels with comprehensible input at your specific level, as well as podcasts and other content. But of course, if you're a bit more advanced, consuming native content also works. So long as you immerse yourself in the language, at the right level, with subtitles on, for as much time as you possibly can, you're probably doing all that you can to acquire language as effectively as possible. But I can already hear some of you ask, well, what about speaking? And don't worry, I hear your worries. I mean, after all, we're all told that speaking is very, very important to learn a language. But is that really the case? And what does the research say about output's role in second language acquisition? That's what we'll go over in the next section, which is all about speaking and output. You've probably heard that the key to learning a language is to speak as much as possible, as soon as possible, and that some people can perfectly understand the language, but just can't seem to speak it. Is that really true? Well, unlike input, which pretty much all researchers agree is essential, the role of output for second language acquisition is a little bit more complex. The main benefits of it is outlined in Merle Swain's output hypothesis, where she suggests speaking can help you notice gaps in your knowledge, test your grammar, and reflect on sentence structures. Now, this all sounds great, right? Well, there are a few things to consider. Unlike what most people seem to think, Swain did not agree with the fact that output was key to fluency, but rather, like Krashen and most researchers, said that input was key to fluency, and that output simply helped improve on the stuff that you'd already acquired from input. So what you can really take away from this is that input is still king, but that output has some benefits as sort of a complementary activity to help refine what it is you've already learned from input. And this brings us back to the idea of certain people being able to understand languages but just not speak them, which is something that seems to make sense on a surface level, but once you understand how language is actually acquired, it doesn't anymore. The reason for this is pretty simple in my opinion. It's A, that they can understand as much as they think, which is just fixed by more input, or B, that they haven't spoken a lot and therefore have unrealistic standards of how good they're supposed to be when just starting out. These standards can make speaking stressful and therefore stop them from accessing their full abilities. The solution to this is not starting to speak from day one every day, but rather to make sure you already have a decent understanding of the language and then start speaking gradually, without the expectation of perfection. You won't be 100% fluent at first, but that doesn't mean you should have spoken earlier. All that means is that you just need a bit more practice to sort of learn how to produce these sounds and activate the knowledge you've already built up. So despite popular belief, it's actually input and not output that teaches you how to speak. All output does is perfect and sort of refine the stuff you've already learned from input. Now, this is probably where some of you are like, okay, I get it, input is what teaches you language, but surely outputting just a little bit can't be that bad, right? I mean, it's practice after all. And I understand your sentiment, but this is like getting into the boxing gym and after just one session being like, alright, it's time to get in the cage, time to fight. It's like, okay, well, maybe hold your horses a little bit, let's chill out, let's practice a little bit more and just like learn how to throw a decent punch before getting in a fight. I get that you want to get that good at some point, but maybe just learn the basics first. In the same way, maybe just learn like how to understand a basic conversation before you try to start having one. If all you know is how to introduce yourself and say, how are you? Well, the conversation isn't gonna go that far, right? They say something difficult back and you're like, and then you're just standing there looking like an idiot. I bet you don't want to be feeling that way, which is perfectly understandable. And so that's actually a reason for why certain people tend to wait years before speaking, which sounds a bit extreme to me too, but I do think there's some merit to that. So let's go over the benefits of waiting with speaking. Maybe not a few years, but perhaps a few months. It would seem that any form of practice is good practice. And I guess in certain regards that's probably true. But when it comes to early output, the reality of it is that the stress is often not worth the reward. With you just stumbling over words, speaking about very limited topics, having long pauses and not really understanding what's being said to you back. Krashen therefore recommends a so-called silent period, where you either don't speak at all or speak very, very little. The reason for this being ideal is that it can lower your early stage anxiety, it can increase your confidence due to the fact that you're learning more, and it can also just help you acquire more language straight up because of the fact that you're not focused on both speaking and inputting at the same time. Now, of course, outputting does have some benefits, but that's largely due to the fact that people are speaking back to you, so you're receiving input in that way. But you also gotta remember that just because something has some benefit does not mean it's worth doing. An opportunity cost is a term that describes this phenomenon perfectly, and states that even though something like output has a benefit, it's not automatically worth doing if the alternative of just getting more input has a higher benefit. And other linguists such as Harry Winnetz or James Asher also recommend delayed speech. Asher, like Krashen, recommends focusing on meaning and not being forced to output until learners are ready for it and are able to spontaneously speak. So for a little recap, speaking skills are built from input, which should be the number one focus. But output does also have some benefits, specifically for the intermediate to advanced learner. And what it does best is teaching you how to speak better once you've already built that foundation from input. That's why a good recommendation would be to start outputting by the time where you feel pretty comfortable just putting on a random YouTube video or TV show and understanding a good bit of it. It doesn't have to be all of it, but the majority of stuff that's being said. And something that will really determine your progress is your motivation. Not only because it's required to actually get started in the beginning and keep doing what you're doing, but also because it has a very big effect on how much you actually learn from what it is you're doing, which is something that most people are not aware of. So we'll go over all this and more in our next section, which is all about motivation and its role in second language acquisition. Now, what if I told you that motivation is not only about starting and continuing to learn, but also about how much you learn? This is something Crashing called the affective filter. If two learners are reading the same text or watching the same movie, but one of them is very interested in it and the other person is just kind of bored, maybe stressed out from something, then this person will learn a lot more language than the other person, even if they're doing the exact same thing for the exact same amount of time. And this is due to many different reasons. Could be because you're simply not enjoying what you're doing, could be because of stress, could be because you're anxious or frustrated. And so this is where it's important to really find stuff that you enjoy. And also why my previous recommendations on what you want to do in what order might vary a little bit, because you might enjoy something that another person doesn't. So it's not that people acquire language differently, that's also a myth, but it's rather that people enjoy different things, which therefore affects how much language they learn from it. With that being said, the ideal approach would obviously be to increase motivation for the most effective activities. And that's where we can take some inspiration from linguist Zoltan Dernier's work on motivation. There are, according to Dernier, 3 different parts of motivation for language learning. The first being language level motivation, which could be, for example, you wanting to learn Japanese because you want to travel to the country. The second would be improving your own beliefs about your ability and building confidence through positive interactions with the language, and that's learner level motivation. And the third part is learning situation level, which is stuff like picking the right resources. So in terms of Japanese, that could be, for example, rewatching one of your old favorite animes. In short, this type of learner will stay motivated for longer and reach higher levels of fluency. But something else that helps for motivation is what Dernier called the ideal L2 self. This is essentially the future you that you're aspiring to become. So to take the Japanese example again, it could be that you're aspiring to become someone who's walking down the streets of Tokyo, going to cool places and being able to talk to the people there. And this is actually something that I did without even knowing it myself and knowing the benefits of it, and 2 years later, it became reality for me. The reason this probably works so well in my opinion is because it sort of acts like a North Star that is your motivation when you don't really feel like doing stuff. That helps you push through those moments where you don't want to study, but you know you have to do it anyways because you want to reach that final goal. Now to wrap up this video, I want to go over the main practical steps you can take to start learning as effectively as possible right now. The first step will be to set clear goals and a vision for what you want to achieve. Is it to watch anime without subtitles? To get to a basic level because you like traveling to the country, or maybe you want to move there and get completely fluent? Whatever it is, you want to focus on input, not output or traditional learning. Input, whether you're listening or reading, is really the only thing that will get you fluent. Output improves on what you've already acquired, and traditional learning is best for test scores, not actual fluency. So pick any input resource you enjoy. Movies, TV shows, videos, books, anything really works so long as it's in the target language, ideally with that language's subtitles. Learning the most common words in grammar can be good when you first start out, since a lot of input will be too difficult, especially if you're learning a less popular language and there isn't a lot of easier material available. But for most people, getting started consuming input ASAP is a good idea. No one's saying you gotta start out watching philosophical debates, so just pick something easy and progress with time. Once you've done this for a while and you feel like you understand quite a lot, then by all means start speaking a bit. But waiting to speak, or at least not focusing on it in the beginning, can lower stress, and most importantly, give you more time for input. And that's about it. If you follow the steps that we've talked about in this video, then you can feel pretty confident that you're doing all you can to learn languages in the most effective way possible, based on what we currently know from the research and from just some practical thinking and experience. But doing some small minor tweaks to this won't really matter that much, so long as you follow the main core principles of focusing on input and then outputting a little bit after a while once you want to get really good at speaking. And if you want to make this whole journey a lot easier, then you should probably check out the video on the screen right now, where I talk about 5 habits that I think set apart successful from unsuccessful language learners. Thank you guys for watching, and until next time, keep learning.